How far back do the Ediacaran biotas go? It's a really interesting question, and it has lots of implications in terms of where they originated, what they even are. So what we really want to look at is the oldest examples of Ediacaran biota assemblages out there. Now, some of them are well known, such as Mistaken Point and so on, at about 570-ish, 575 million years. But there is one that's older, allegedly. This is the Ochre Point assemblage from just over 600 million, probably. And I think we need to take a good close look at this. Welcome back to another instalment of Ediacaran Weirdness. Now, I know how much you like it, and I can't blame you. It's an amazing interval, predating or possibly contemporaneous with the first animals. Lots of debates on that in the previous videos. I'm sure we'll be doing lots more in future. But one thing that's pretty clear is that there is a consistent assemblage of these strange fossils, multiple assemblages from different environments, shallow water, deep water, and so on. But they are consistent assemblages of fossils that date back to about 575 million years. The youngest ones, apart from a few leftovers in the Cambrian, and possibly later, go back to about 540, 538 million years, and during that interval, for the latter half of the Ediacaran, there are generally consistent assemblages. So the question is, where did they come from? How far back can we trace them? And what does that tell us about their origins? Because one thing that's quite clear about them is that they are generally distinct. You don't really find that many intermediates between, say, rangeomorphs, these frond-like things, and Dickinsoniomorphs, with these flat mattress-like things that flopped around on the seafloor everywhere at the right time. We don't see forms that are intermediate between them that show a diversification of some ancestral Ediacaran into these weird and wonderful things that then disappear later on. So, if we can trace back the earliest assemblages, what do we find? Well, we do find the earliest assemblages that we know of are all the deep water Avalon assemblage communities. So these are dominated by rangeomorphs, these frond-like things, and a few other groups like arboreomorphs, the sort of basically branching frond-like things, and then weird bits and pieces. But it's looking like some of the shallow water forms, the White Sea assemblage, where we see the full diversity of weird and wonderful little critters, those we now know from this other assemblage, see the video, appear to have originated earlier than we thought, albeit maybe not quite as early as some of the other Avalon assemblage communities, and in slightly deeper water. Now, we have a lot of Ediacaran biota assemblages around the world. It's not just one or two. There are large numbers of them in the right sort of environments, where you get the algal mats or volcanic ash beds, or algal mats and volcanic ash beds. We don't find them only very rarely. It seems to be a type of fossilization that happened quite repeatedly and consistently around the world at this sort of time interval, probably partly because of these mat grounds, these microbial mats that were covering the sea floors and promoting the conditions needed to have these things fossilized. We don't know exactly what they were made of, but they seem to be quite robust, although soft-bodied. And so you would expect them to have a pretty good fossil record that we can trace even further back, because these microbial mats carry on for a long time. I mean, before the Ediacaran, it was basically a world of microbes and some algae and things like that as well. But microbial mats are not scarce in the Precambrian as a whole. So we should expect them to be able to trace these assemblages back and find those really early ones that actually show us the origination of the rangeomorphs, of the Dickinsoniomorphs, of all of these other things, and hopefully show us whether there was some sort of explosive radiation very early on at maybe 600 million or something, which then gave rise to all these separate lineages that stayed separate until the end of the Cambrian. So, what is the earliest known Ediacaran assemblage? And this is one that a couple of people have pointed out to me. I think Igloo was one of them. Can't remember who the other one. Sorry. But anyway, whoever you were, thank you very much. Because I had not noticed it. It is from Australia. It was only published last year by Plummer and Milness. Published in the Transactions of the Royal Society of South Australia. Now, this is a perfectly legitimate journal, but it's a local one. It's not something which is generating huge press releases around the world. And that might immediately make you think that possibly it's not quite as dramatic a discovery as you might hope for. But it's certainly a good journal, and this deserves a serious treatment. So let's have a look, shall we? Do we believe it is, as always, the question. First, the background. So this is actually quite important and very useful because it's in the same general area as the classic Ediacara hills of South Australia. So it is in South Australia, Adelaide is just here, and Ochre Point is just to the south of it. Only a little way along the coast, actually, so it's really quite close by and fairly accessible, which is surprising. Most of these places you have to take a helicopter trip to and then paddle for 3 days in a canoe or something, but this is quite handy. And in terms of where the Flinders Ranges are, which includes the Ediacara Hills, then they are up here, just north of Adelaide. So it's the same sort of area, and it's still part of the same general geological succession. But these are significantly older, these rocks here. So it is part of a long succession of different formations, which includes the Nilpena sandstone member and the Ediacara sandstone member. And then a succession of formations below that, including scoured, sort of channelized ones, going through things like the Bunyerichnus formation, and eventually down into the Murilla formation, which is above the Mululu formation. But this is all part of the Brachina subgroup, which is all part of the Ediacaran. And so we have a continuous succession here relate to. We know that this is several formations below the classic formations with the Ediacara assemblages, things like the Dickinsonia and all the rest of that, is all up here in the Rawnsley quartzite. So this is substantially older than any of those other famous biotas. And that's significant, of course. But the question is how much older, and here is where it gets a little bit dubious. There are no wonderfully accurate dates. There are some poorly constrained ones, and there aren't many of them. But they make a pretty good case that this is between 600 and 625-ish million years, and probably somewhere towards the middle of that. So maybe sort of 610 to 620, something of that nature. But it's about 600 million years plus by the looks of it. And given that the base of the Ediacaran is about 635, that makes perfect sense. Now, if you remember, the Avalon assemblages at Mistaken Point and places like that go back to about 575. So this is 25 million years older than those formations, which is really interesting, because this really is getting into the point where we might start to hope to see the beginnings of the Ediacara Biota. So then it gets into the types of rocks that we have. And one thing that's quite striking is this is an extremely shallow water sequence. It's exposed on the coastline here, and there's a series of wave-cut platforms, and you go looking at these rocks and they are extremely sandy. They look like they have been affected by a lot of very turbulent water when they were being laid down. There are all sorts of desiccation cracks going on. There are scours and troughs and cross-bedded bits. It's a really complex sort of set of rocks, which is a mixture of mudstone, sandstone, bits of conglomerate in there as well. And you can see these sort of what we call furrows and troughs cutting through some layers. You've got this sort of reddish sand which is cutting down into the mud cracks, which have been caused by desiccation. So this has been exposed severely at times. It's dried out and cracked, and then you've had more sediment coming in on top. It's a very, very complicated set of exposures. And in cross-section, you can clearly see that there is a lot of cross-bedding. There are scours, there are truncated beds. This is a very active environmental area where you have probably sediment coming in a deltaic situation, so through the mouth of a river that's dumping loads of sediment in shallow water. You've got waves cutting across and then reorganizing that, and then you have storms coming through sometimes, which are causing even more chaos. What they're not showing really at all is evidence of mat grounds. These microbial mats that tend to cover the surfaces and the typical Ediacara members, and these are something you might hope to find because they're kind of important in terms of the preservation as far as we're aware. So the preservation of these Ediacaran fossils tends to rely on the existence of these mat grounds to help promoting the burial, the mineralization, and so on. And basically the overall preservation of these fossils is dependent, we think, on the mat grounds or on volcanic ash layers. So the fact that they're not seeing that is worrying to start with. But fair enough. That's what we've got, and there's no reason why we can't have other things preserved in unusual circumstances that don't involve mats. So, what have they got? Most of the fossils described in this paper are these things. Dark brown, rounded, lumpy things, which at first glance just look like mineral lumps. They look like concretions. And possibly at second glance too, we'll come back to that. But they look as though they are mostly scattered. Sometimes there are aggregates of them. They are various sizes, and they are three-dimensional structures, which in some cases have little cracks running around inside them as well. You look in closer at these things, and it suddenly looks a lot more sort of dramatic at first glance. But the problem is that here they're being compared with other things. The left side are the specimens from Ochre Point, and this is a polished vertical section, which we'll have a good look at in a minute, and you can see that it's had dotted white lines drawn over it, which are meant to be highlighting the structure. I always find that problematic because if they're not showing it without the lines, you don't know whether those structures are really there. But what they're comparing it with directly is this Bunyerichnus, which is a trace fossil which is believed to be made by actiniarians, basically sea anemones that embed themselves in the seafloor. They make these traces today, and you have the sort of almost anchor-like depressions in the sediment, which are then filled in with more sediment coming in, and fills in the gaps once the animal has vacated it or just died and then left a hollow behind. They're also comparing it with a thing called Ernietta, which is the upper right image, and this is one of the things in the Nama beds from the very latest Ediacaran. And we'll come back to Ernietta later, but you can see it's got some quite distinctive details on the structure of this, which is how you can recognize these things. So again, the left side is the structures here. This is clearly broken through this, and most of these structures that we're seeing on these surfaces, the previous page, are actually broken through because it's an exposed bedding plane, and it seems to have been cut off at various points because we're not seeing the upper surface. It's always a sort of a rough transverse section through it. That is also important. And then in the side view, you've got the sort of very rounded base with a sort of sometimes or quite often a sort of gutter-like structure here, and then again the broken off upper surface. At the bottom right is a thing called Bunyerichnus, which is believed to be a resting trace of something like a cnidarian again, and is found as sandstone protrusions on the bottom of sandstone beds. So it's basically an extension of the bed downwards into the underlying sediment. So you're filling in a hollow on the sea floor, effectively. Now, true Bunyerichnus has a little sort of bump in the centre, again pointing downwards, hence the name. You can probably work that one out. And then you have other ones like this paper by Dernov, 2022, described a new species in which there are much more irregular rounded lumps on the base of sandstone beds. And that's what's really being compared with here. Now, the problem I have with that is that it's actually not entirely clear whether these things are trace fossils at all, or what we call lode casts. So this is where you have a sandstone layer or a sand layer being deposited on top of a softer, muddier layer. And because the sand is denser, it tends to sink into the mud. So you get sort of instabilities in the surface, and what was a flat surface ends up protruding downwards into troughs and all sorts of odd structures. And you end up with these very lumpy underbed surfaces of the sandstone layers, which produce these casts of sand on the underside. And I think that is possibly what is going on with some of these. This particular paper, which is the one that's most similar to the specimens that have been described from Ochre Point, is probably not that convincing from the photos that I've seen. I had a quick look at that paper, and they are very irregular, very lumpy, and it looks like, to me, it's just, in many cases, lode casts going down into the underlying sediment. So the question is, what are these structures? And we can have a look at this cut and polished vertical section. You can see the diagonal lines going across here from the saw. But it's unclear exactly what these white lines are tracing. I think there probably are structures in there, but because of the lines being superimposed on them, I can't see what those structures are. Certainly it looks like it is a different colour and a different texture inside and outside. And the authors are saying that they cannot be concretions because it's a different sediment inside to outside. However, that's not backed up with any really detailed illustrations or analyses or anything like that. I can't actually tell that that is a different sediment. It could be the same sediment differently cemented. Because if you have the sediment being cemented quite early, and then you end up with the internal structure not being compressed as much, and lots of fine pore spaces being filled in with crystals. And to give you an idea, this is a concretion that I had lying around in the garden. This one is a Silurian one. It's calcium carbonate that grew in mudstone, and they're very, very common throughout the Silurian of this area. And inside these, you often get fossils. They're quite often nucleated on bits of shelly material or something, but sometimes you don't. They can be entirely inorganic. And you can see it's got quite a lumpy texture. It's quite tall. And in this case, you can hopefully just make out there is a little bit, bits falling off everywhere, lovely, of a sort of trough. There's a shadow around this sort of edge around here, which is where there is slightly different layers within the sediment which have cemented differently. So you can end up with these things growing sideways or radially, but they grow more in some directions than others and in some levels than others because of differences in the porosity of the original sediment. I should probably say they basically are growths of a mineral that form within the sediment after burial and before it's become a rock. So they're simply crystal growths. They can have a nucleation site in the centre, and then they grow out in all directions just because of the ambient chemistry. Now, they can have unusual shapes, and this sort of groove around the centre is not at all uncommon. There can be specific reasons where you get them in a particular level due to the chemistry, and then that level also tends to be slightly less permeable than the bits slightly above and below, so you can characteristically in some levels get a sort of belted structure like that. Now they say it's a different sediment, and it certainly looks different. I mean, go back to that bedding plane assemblages, and they are very dark brown compared with the surrounding rock, and that is curious. I mean, I don't know, because they don't actually clarify and they don't illustrate, whether that is meant to be this sort of red mud that's infilling it, or whether it's a cement. And it just strikes me that that sort of colour is exactly what you get in siderite concretions in the Carboniferous of the UK and lots of other places. And this is iron carbonate, and it tends to form in abundance in deltaic type situations. So where you have fresh water meeting seawater, you can very commonly, at least in the Carboniferous, have siderite forming en masse. And this is a deltaic environment, apparently. And it has the hallmarks, it seems to me, of these being possibly just concretions. The problem is that I am working on very limited information that's presented in the paper. The authors tell me that these cannot be concretions because the sediment is different, but I can't see that. I can't be certain that that is correct. And going by the appearance of the photographs, it looks to me just as likely that these are simply concretions, maybe of iron carbonate, maybe of calcium carbonate that is oxidized. Because if you take one of these limestone concretions, they're blue inside originally, but the weathered surfaces go brown because of the buildup of iron oxides during the process of oxidation of the concretions. So I'm really not sure what is going on with these, but I don't see any clear evidence that they are fossils at all. I think they're probably, well, I think the null hypothesis, which has yet to be disproven, is that they are concretions. It may be that they have more evidence, that they can see more evidence in the specimens, but I can't see it from the photos. So what else have they got? And that is the majority, but they also have, they say, rarer disc-like things, including Aspidella, which is the attachment discs of the frond-like organisms you get in the Ediacaran Biotas. And they say they have these, including the base of a frond. So we have one specimen illustrated of this, and here it is. It's the upper one. The lower one is for comparison. This is from the classic Ediacaran assemblages of the same region, South Australia, but much younger. So this upper one, you can see immediately there is a certain potential similarity there. I mean, it's got the right sort of shape. But is it convincing? You zoom in on it a little bit, and it's... The authors are pointing out this stalk here, which is sort of basically wiggly lines demarcating something from something. And again, this might be real. But on the other hand, there are multiple very similar wiggly lines going through this entire surface because it has been tectonized. This is a rock that has had a hard time. It has been battered around a bit, and it has been probably buried quite deeply. It has been fractured, and you end up with lots of little lines which tend to be parallel because the stress field tends to be parallel. And this looks like they are, well, I don't see any clear reason to think that that is actually a stalk rather than just some more of these lines. So, again, you compare with the one from the Ediacara Hills, and there are definite structures. There is a longitudinal lineation on this stalk. It's a very different texture on the surface between that and the background. And we don't see any of that. We just see some wiggly lines which coincide with it. And then that leaves us with this round structure itself. And yes, superficially at least, it looks kind of discoidal, but what is that like in 3 dimensions? I have no idea whether this is a broken section through one of these very three-dimensional possible trace fossils, possible nodules, concretions. And it's just not enough, in my view. There's no evidence of microbial mats on these surfaces. There's no obvious sign of how these would have been fossilized. And it's just too similar to some of the structures we were seeing on the weathered structures on these original bedding planes. And most of them are very dark brown, but you do see others are more sort of the same sort of colour as the surroundings, and the exact colour of these things is going to be dependent on the exact chemistry of these concretions and what has happened to them since. So again, I'm just not happy. If that really is an Aspidella holdfast with the base of a frond stuck to it, then surely there are going to be better ones. Surely there are unambiguous ones, or at least consistent structures. So I think they need to go back and get some more. Okay, there's one other fossil, only one, which they are arguing is something important here, and that is the upper left panel here, which they are claiming is the remains of a frond. Possibly. They're leaving this a bit questionable. So we have here another couple of specimens, upper right and lower left, of fronds from the Ediacara Biota, and then the lower right is an interpretation drawing of the one on the lower left. So this is the one we're actually looking at. And my problem with this sort of illustration in general is that they can be really useful just to give people a pointer as to how to interpret these the fossils. But if the ones you're comparing with are much clearer and much better preserved, then there is a real risk that what you're doing is making people see things in a way that isn't really viable. So let's have a close look at particularly this one at the upper left, and the one at the upper right, part B, is one of the Ediacara ones where you've got very fine detail, there's little ridges, there's wrinkles all over it. But this one, upper left, well, what can you actually see there? Do we see any regularity? Are there regular lateral units? Is there an axis? Is there a sort of quadrangular arrangement of these units that form the frond there? Because you can just about sort of squint a bit and start to see in the centre a few sort of almost rhomboidal type shapes. But to me, there is nothing there that is consistent. There's nothing there that looks like an organised array of anything much. And in fact, what this reminds me of most, I'm sorry to say, is an actual bit of microbial mat. Something with irregular wrinkles, densely wrinkled in the centre, fading out at the edges to more sort of faint and looser wrinkles, which then just sort of fade away in the surroundings. And this is the sort of thing that you expect for isolated bits of microbial mat texture. So, yeah, it's just not convincing again, and this is a real problem. So the authors are also trying to back up this story by saying that there are similar things from elsewhere. So the same formation in Bunyerichnus Gorge, which is in the Flinders Ranges, so we're going up to the same area as the classic Ediacara localities, but the same formation as this. They claim, and this is a paper by one of the authors from the previous year, 2024, that they have Aspidella discs with, again, fronds attached to them. And once again, we see rounded lumps, and then a structure here which is highlighted again in the white lines and compared directly with one from the Ediacara Biota itself. And again, is that really convincing? To me, it really isn't. I mean, could it theoretically be one of these, but extremely poorly preserved? That's hard to rule out, because you've got an elongate couple of very faint ridges, But there are other areas with faint ridges. This entire surface is irregular and faintly ridged. If there was really good examples in the same layers which were unambiguous, then you'd say, yeah, probably that's a poorly preserved one. But there aren't. This is the best one. And so what you're left with is, again, a layer that contains some rounded, apparently three-dimensional lumps that look very like concretions, or possibly even just load casts on the underside of a bed. And then there are these structures, some of which potentially just fortuitously are associated with them in a loose approximation, but without any fine detail joining the things together. So that, I think, is, again, unfortunately, it doesn't really help the arguments. It doesn't really support the idea that this one that they are arguing is an Aspidella with a frond attached to it is actually what they say it is. So this is all a bit disappointing, isn't it, really? I mean, there is one other thing they describe. This is from a Gleisner paper. It's a reproduction. And this part B is a strange thing, which is called Bunyerichnus, from Bunyero Gorge. And it is, again, from the same age, mid-Brachina sequence. And it is a very peculiar thing indeed. I mean, this is a definite structure. I can see regularity. I can see a midline. I can see lateral sort of transverse ridges. And it's being compared here with Paramedusium, which is the edge of a sort of discoidal medusoid, as they were called. This is from Gleisner in 1969, by the way, so it's going back a bit. And yeah, that is an interesting thing. I mean, the term ichnus, or the suffix ichnus, suggests that Gleisner was thinking that this was a trace fossil. Could it be a sort of a tool mark of something which has been rolling over the surface? I'm not entirely sure what to make of this, because it looks very, very advanced. And this is much more convincing in some ways as something intriguing, something actually definite, than anything in this paper from 2025. They're also comparing it, by the way, with the Ernietomorphs, in fact, in Pteridinium, where you have these sort of lateral units. And yeah, you can kind of see where that's coming from as well. Could this be something like a Pteridinium, but with slightly odd preservation, just an impression of it, or something like that? And the authors in this new paper are suggesting that these things I think are concretions, these depressions in the bed which are infilled, are either resting traces of sea anemones, or they are Ernietomorphs, which are typical of the Nama assemblage, so they're sort of very late assemblage, and they're sort of bag-like things that you get in the sediment. Now, in the Nama beds, you don't get different sediment inside and outside in general, unless they've been transported. You get they basically form a thin bag which is stuck in the sediment, and then the inside is infilled with the same sediment as the outside. So whichever way you slice it, this new paper itself doesn't look that exciting to me. I don't think you can really call this an Ediacara Biota assemblage. I don't think any of these here are definitely even biological. I mean, possibly microbial mat for the last one. But to me, I think this is a set of artifacts of inorganic chemistry, effectively. Chemistry and tectonics. And I can't prove that. But unfortunately, the problem is that the authors haven't proven that either. I mean, I would really like this to be, obviously, a precursor to the Ediacara Biota, because it would start to give us a polarization of the characters. It would give us a starting point for where all this diversity came from. It would show us how they evolved, potentially, if we have a real biota which is a precursor to these later ones. I would love it to be that, but I can't argue that it is. I can't see it from this material. So, that said, this Bunyerichnus, I think I'm going to have to go and look into quite a lot more, because that is a peculiar thing. And whatever you interpret that as, it's interesting. I mean, really, potentially quite interesting. But I'm going to have to look into that a lot more, get my head around the variation that there is in these specimens, try to understand it a bit better, and hopefully get somewhere from there. But this has been a really interesting foray for me into the depths of the Ediacaran fossil record, because I've never really looked at this stuff before, the very early things. And I can see why this assemblage isn't famous. I can see why it's not apparently generally accepted as an earliest Ediacaran biota. But it is still possible that they're just really, really poorly preserved examples of the sort of things that came later. So I'm very glad that I've had a look at it. And at the moment, I'm going to have to stay more, well, slightly on the fence, but sitting mostly on the side of it ain't real, but with just a little fingertip resting on the top in case there's some more evidence coming in future that actually convinces me. And I would love to be convinced in this one, because, yeah, I just want to know what these things are. And if we can trace them back to this sort of time, or even earlier, then we'll start to get a much better feel for where they came from, what they evolved from, and possibly, therefore, what they actually are. But that, unfortunately, is about it for this one. So, not as good as I was hoping, but still really, really interesting. Partly even just as a cautionary tale, again, in how one interprets these difficult structures. And hopefully there's a lot more out there in Bunyeroo Gorge as well. I'm going to have to go digging into the literature to see what's been described from there, because clearly some things have. And that's an interesting thing. Right. Thank you again for the recommendations to look into this one. And yeah, I will come back with more bits. I think we're going to go into the Cambrian a little bit next. There's a few interesting little bits and pieces that have been coming out. And I also want to do some more sort of questions. I want to explore some of the big questions I have left about the Cambrian. What we don't know, where we can find out the answers, and why we don't have the answers yet. Plenty to look forward to anyway. Thank you again for sticking around, and I'll see you again soon. Bye for now.